falls at times into the communobiological realm, where, I mean, Little John had that little box about the communobiological, and McCroskey, right? And that it's a paradigm shift for some people to say that the differences in communication styles are related to brain hardwiring. We had a student for a while. I don't know what happened to Karina. Does anybody know what happened to Karina? Karina Maletsky? I haven't seen Karina in a long time. She was very interested in the communobiological question.
She was in crisis management. Oh, she's in the other class.
Is she? Yeah. Well, she was always very, in theory class, she was always interested in the communobiological. How much of this is just hardwired into people? This is what we talk about communication apprehension, too. You know, some people feel like people who are anxious about public speaking have some hard wiring to their amygdala thing, and that just makes them more that way. And so it's not a matter of teaching them or talking to them, it's a biological issue. So this is what psychologists like to think about. All right, let's get another example of a socio-psychological approach to communication. The elaboration likelihood theory, which is diagrammed here for us. Elaboration likelihood. All right. So again, the question from Bob Craig's perspective, it's a practical question. How do you get people to listen to your message and think about what you're saying? They get bombarded with hundreds of messages a day. You know, when do people listen to stuff, and when does it really change them? That's the question. So people have framed that question in the socio-psychological around this language of elaboration. And they say, all right, we'll call that, if a person pays attention to the message and really thinks about it carefully, we'll call that they elaborate the message through central processing. And if they just hear it and sort of let it go by without doing a whole lot with it, we'll call that they're non-elaborating and peripheral processing. So we give it names, we give it tags, and we begin to describe it. So we have central and peripheral approaches, and we create these diagrams. Again, this is something that socio-psychological research does often. It makes connections and boxes and creates variables and language to describe these things. So somebody is persuasively communicating. They're saying, we've got to clear the undergrowth in California so that we never have this happen again. We have to have a policy of, you know, running through there with timed burns and all this stuff. Well, they say, all right, the first question that the mind hits is motivation. Is there a personal relevance to me? Do I need to be involved in this? Does this affect me directly? Yes or no? So they make a flow chart out of it. So if no, then it shifts over to a peripheral route. This is not really going to affect me. I don't need to give my precious brain processing power to this. Now, in case you're not catching this, this is a mechanical cybernetic model of the brain, right? The brain has memory processing power. Does this sound like your Mac, or does this sound like your IBM? You know, yeah, we use this language to describe what happens in the human brain. You know, it's not hard to think that 100 years from now we may be talking about it differently. You know, if we get quantum computing or biological computing, we'll start to talk about this differently. But right now, we talk about it in language that is familiar to us, is metaphorical. So central and peripheral processing. So is there a cue? Is this positive or negative? Are there expert sources? You know, is there a reason that I should deal with this? You know, and then I retain, or do I change my attitude or not? So if there's something else in this message that calls attention to it, then I make sort of a shift in my peripheral understanding of these things. You know, I make a shift, which then leads back into whether I want to process the next message that comes along. So I live in, you know, New Jersey, so I'm not going to be affected by the California wildfire policy. But, you know, do I think about it? Is it a positive thing to prevent harm? Yeah, it's a positive thing to prevent harm. So I think it's a good idea. How strongly do I think it's a good idea? Not real strongly, but it's a peripherally held view. So that goes into my peripheral thing. If I don't see anything special about it, this model says you just leave your attitude alone. You're like, I don't know, I don't care. Or whatever it was. So this model models, it says, here's what's going on. It's a theory, it explains, predicts. So am I motivated to process it? No. Is there anything special about it? Yes or no? I go back. Then it says, well, yes, I'm motivated personally. Now, do I have the ability to process this message? So that gets into questions of, do I understand the language that the person is speaking? You know, I mean, if they're speaking in French or Italian or whatever, then maybe I can't process it. I don't have the ability to process it. Do I know the technical language that they're using? Can I hear them? You know, am I in the nosebleed seats, you know, and I can't hear them? I think it's relevant to me, but I can't hear it. So then I just kick over and let it drift in my attitudes, because I have the ability to process it. Can I think abstractly enough to do this? We'll talk later about cognitive complexity, the idea of constructs in our minds, and to describe things, and how complex are our constructs. This is social psychology language. So again, if I have the ability to process it, so I'm motivated, yes. I have the ability to process, yes. All right, so now I get into my cognitive processing mode. You know, it travels down the motherboard to the central processor. And I start to categorize it, put it in the right place. You know, I make a shift in what I'm thinking about. I make an attitude change, negative attitude change, vocal training.
Yeah.
I've sung in a choir. I've done that. So anyway, so then it ends up here. If I decide not to change anything, I just send it up to peripheral route, and then it hangs out in a low level attitude change. All right, so this, practically the question is, what do people do with persuasive messages? You know, do they really listen, or don't they listen, or when does it change them or not? That's the practical life question. This is a socio-psychological response to that. It says, well, here's how it works. Bang, 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 bang. So, any thoughts? Yeah.
There are some theories that state that if you really want to induce change in either behavior or attitude, you have to provide a solution, and then the solution has to be accessible, easily accessible for the ones you want to influence. Otherwise, if it's too much an effort that they have to put in,
Right.
they will give up, even if it's a strong belief in the certain change.
Yeah, okay. So you've introduced another variable. See, this would be the question. Well, where in your variable, in your process here, we would say, does the variable of the ability to apply the change, come in?
I guess it's very much related with the article that you presented yesterday, Andrew, with the social influence. It was in communication as.
Yes.
Okay, well, I believe that, at least in my opinion, if change is first induced at an attitude level and there's behavior.
Right.
So probably the solution, providing the solution would come after changing beliefs, and then when it comes to behavior, then the solution will have to come in handy. Otherwise, the whole effort of changing attitudes would be in vain, because it won't come to that change in
well,
behavior.
within your model, right.
I'm guessing.
Right. I mean, every model leads to consequences. This is what we're going to see with Berger. If you hold these things, then it means these things. Yeah. I mean, there are other models of change that I was talking. I forget who I think it was Melissa. I was talking about paradoxical intervention. There's a theory of paradoxical intervention that there sometimes you just need to totally violate the expectations of a situation.
Oh yes.
And that will kick the whole thing, just flip the whole thing in one swoop. Yeah.
There was a very interesting article that I read on memory when doing the research on the scholarly magazines and communication. There was the article that stated that deviant news and deviant messages have a higher chance of being memorized than
non-deviant. Yeah. So as you have the morning show or the Daily Show with John, and Colbert, what's going on there? Well, there's a theory then that explains it, that these are expectancy violations in the thing, and you could have a whole theory of comedic communication, if you were, but it would probably be a socio-psychological theory that would ask questions about processes and attitudes and messages and acceptance ranges and things like this. A lot of variable stuff to work on there.
I guess that all those variables and the choice in variables depends on the message that you want to build. For instance, the fear factor is very commonly used in certain social campaigns like non-smoking or stuff. But
right.
Then again, it depends, because if you abuse on those two, you can have the
right. And what is like with the fear messages, like this is your brain on drugs, here's the frying pan and the egg, Well, when is too much, and in conjunction with what is it most effective? Is it when paired with this, is it most effective? Or when it follows this, sequentially, it's most effective. Those are the questions socio-psychological people want to answer by put those variables down, think about the variables, construct a possible relationship, and then test it.
I guess there are different combinations that you need to use.
Yes. And that's what research in the socio-psychological tradition would be about. And so I brought this with me today. This is my source book of communication research measures book. So when you're in theory, methodology class, quantitative in particular, you'll be faced with the question that you theorize some variable, and then the question will be, how do you operationalize that variable? How do you measure it? How do you measure fear of something? How do you measure liking or affinity or aggressiveness or tolerance for ambiguity? Well, there are measures that have been generated within the field that have been proven or tested for two things. Who knows the two things that they're tested for? And reliability. Validity and reliability, right? So those are two things that have to be tested in a measure of a variable. Is it a valid measure? Is it a reliable measure? And so you get these things where you get organizational conflict instrument, interpersonal solidarity scale, organizational communication audit, organizational culture survey. Here's the organizational culture survey. So we're going to measure some variables. We're going to measure variables of teamwork, morale, information flow, involvement, supervision, and meetings. Those are the variables we're going to talk about. So we've operationalized those variables. Now we're going to measure them and as positive or negative things within this company. So we will ask these 36 questions, give you 36 questions, and you fill a scale of 1 to 5 for each question. To a very little extent, 1 is little, 5 is a lot. So the person sits down and they say, the people I work with are direct and honest with each other. Put it down. People I work with accept criticism without becoming defensive. Put it down. People I work with resolve disagreements cooperatively. Put it down. Well, then you get all those numbers, you sort them out, and you come up with a profile for the person who took this. This is their perception of the organizational culture that exists. And on teamwork, it's 3.75 average, and so forth and so on. So now we have assessed these variables, which we believe by our theory of organizations are the most significant root variables in productive and effective organizations. So that's a socio-psychological kind of thing. You can look at this if you want. Maybe I'll pass it around. But but if you were going to do a research project, your job would be, from the literature review you do, to find these tools and instruments and gather them. If you're going to do a doctorate someday, you would have to, create your context. You'd have to say, these are the tools that have been used in this field, and here's how I'm going to use them. And then you do your research, and you make your conclusions. So that's that's part of the socio-psychological picture. What time is it? Let's take a break, huh? We'll break now till 5 after, 10 after, and then come back. Okay.